She gave a dying stranger her only carriage in the pouring rain, expecting nothing in return. 3 days later, a duke arrived at her door to say thank you. He would return 11 more times that month, and by the 12th visit, everyone in the village knew the truth except her. He wasn't coming for his mother anymore. He was coming for her. The rain over Millbrook station fell in sheets so heavy that the gas lamps blurred into smears of orange light, and Clara Whitfield pulled her thin shawl tighter as she hurried along the platform toward the last carriage of the evening. She was in no position to be generous. Her father's shop had failed the previous winter, and the small cottage she shared with her younger brother survived on what little she earned mending gowns for the wives of men far wealthier than she would ever be. The carriage waiting outside the station, an old, borrowed thing with a tired horse, was the only transport she had left, and she needed every hour of daylight it could still give her. She almost didn't see the old woman. Huddled beneath the station's narrow awning, soaked through despite the thin cover, sat an elderly lady in fine but rain-ruined clothes, clutching a cane with white-knuckled hands. Her lips had gone pale. Her breathing came in short, frightened gasps. "Madam?" Clara knelt beside her, heedless of the mud soaking into her skirts. "Are you unwell?" "My carriage," the woman managed. "It did not come. I've been waiting. I don't know how long." Clara looked at the old woman's trembling hands, at the blue tint creeping into her lips, and made a decision she did not have the luxury to make. "Take mine." The woman blinked up at her. "I couldn't possibly. You'll catch your death out. Here, please." Clara was already helping her to her feet, already waving down her own driver. "I'll walk." It isn't far. It was, in fact, quite far, nearly 3 miles through driving rain, in shoes that had already worn thin at the sole. But Clara did not mention this as she settled the old woman into the carriage, tucked a blanket around her shoulders, and gave the driver careful instructions to see her safely wherever she needed to go. "What is your name, child?" the old woman asked, gripping Clara's hand through the carriage window with surprising strength. "Clara Whitfield, madam. And where might I send word once I am recovered?" Clara almost laughed. "There's no need. I only did what anyone would." The old woman's eyes, sharp, assessing, oddly kind, held hers for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "That is precisely what most people would not do. Remember that, Miss Whitfield." The carriage pulled away into the rain, and Clara turned to walk the 3 miles home, entirely unaware that she had just done a kindness that would append the rest of her life. 3 days later, Clara was on her knees in the small garden behind her cottage, attempting to salvage what remained of her herbs after the storm, when she heard wheels on the lane, the particular, unhurried crunch of a carriage far too fine for Millbrook's narrow roads. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and watched with growing bewilderment as a gleaming black carriage, drawn by a matched pair of grays, stopped directly outside her gate. A footman descended first, opening the door with practiced precision, and then a man stepped down, tall, dark-haired, dressed in a coat that likely cost more than Clara's cottage, and looked at the small, weathered house before him with an expression she could not read. "Miss Whitfield?" "Ah, yes." Clara became suddenly painfully aware of the mud on her skirts, the plainness of her hair, the state of her garden. "May I help you?" My name is Julian Ashcombe." He hesitated, as though unused to what came next. Duke of Ashcombe. Clara's breath caught. She had heard the name. Everyone in the county had, attached always to rumors of coldness, of a man who had shut himself away from society since his father's death, who managed his vast estates with ruthless efficiency and precious little warmth. He did not look cold now. He looked, if anything, faintly uncertain. 3 nights ago, he continued, you gave your carriage to a stranger outside Millbrook station. In the rain, though you had every reason not to. Clara's confusion deepened. How could you possibly know that? Because the woman you helped, the Duke said, was my mother. She would not even give her direction easily. Lady Margaret had said, propped against a mountain of pillows, her sharp eyes bright despite her illness. I had to send a footman to Millbrook to ask after a Miss Whitfield, who mended gowns. No family of consequence, no fortune to speak of, and yet she gave up the only carriage she owned to a stranger she'd never met. In weather that might have killed her for the trouble, Julian had listened without much comment, and had assumed the matter would end there, a debt of gratitude, properly discharged with a visit and perhaps a gift, and then forgotten. He had not expected to find himself standing at Clara Whitfield's gate, unable to stop looking at her. She was not, by the standards of the London season, a great beauty. Her hands were roughened by work. Her gown was serviceable, not fashionable. But there was something in the directness of her gaze, an honesty entirely unpracticed, entirely unlike the careful performances he had grown used to among society's daughters, that he found he could not easily dismiss. The Duchess Dowager, Lady Margaret Ashcombe, had caught a chill from her hours in the storm, nothing life-threatening, the physician assured her, but severe enough to keep her abed for a fortnight. It was during that fortnight, confined to her rooms at Ashcombe Hall, that she had told her son the full story of the young woman who had given up her only means of transport for a stranger she owed nothing. She would not even give her direction easily, Lady Margaret had said, propped against a mountain of pillows, her sharp eyes bright despite her illness. I had to send a footman to Millbrook to ask after a Miss Whitfield, who mended gowns. No family of consequence, no fortune to speak of, and yet she gave up the only carriage she owned to a stranger she'd never met, in weather that might have killed her for the trouble. Julian had listened without much comment, and had assumed the matter would end there, a debt of gratitude, properly discharged with a visit and perhaps a gift, and then forgotten. He had not expected to find himself standing at Clara Whitfield's gate, unable to stop looking at her. She was not, by the standards of the London season, a great beauty. Her hands were roughened by work. Her gown was serviceable, not fashionable, but there was something in the directness of her gaze, an honesty entirely unpracticed, entirely unlike the careful performances he had grown used to among society's daughters, that he could not easily dismiss. "Please," he said now, "allow me to replace what you gave up. A carriage, a horse, whatever would ease your circumstances." Clara's chin lifted, and for a moment Julian saw something flash behind her eyes that was not quite offense, but close to it. "I did not help your mother for a reward, your grace. I did not think you had. That is rather the point." She studied him for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether he was mocking her. "Then why come at all?" Julian found to his own surprise, that he did not have a ready answer. Because, he said slowly, in my experience, kindness offered with no expectation of return is rare enough that it deserves to be acknowledged properly. My mother insisted, and I find, now that I am standing here, that I am inclined to agree with her. He returned the following week, ostensibly to inquire after Clara's brother, whom Lady Margaret had mentioned suffered from a weak chest. He brought a physician's letter of introduction, and, tucked beside it, a small basket of provisions that he insisted were merely surplus from the Ashcombe kitchens, and not, whatever Clara might think, charity. Clara did not entirely believe him, but she was practical enough not to refuse a kindness that would genuinely help her brother, and gracious enough to invite the Duke in for tea despite the modesty of her small parlor. It was, Julian would later admit to himself, the most uncomfortable and most enjoyable hour he had spent in years. Clara did not flatter him. She did not perform the careful deference he had grown accustomed to from young women who knew precisely what a duke's attention might mean for their prospects. I don't quite follow, she argued with him gently, but firmly, about a point of estate management he had mentioned in passing, and was, he realized with some astonishment, entirely correct. You disagree with me rather a lot for a woman meeting a duke for the second time, he observed, not entirely able to keep the amusement from his voice. Would you prefer I agree with everything you said, your grace? Say no, he admitted. I find I would not. He returned the week after that, and the week after that. By the fourth visit he had stopped inventing reasons. By the seventh, Clara had stopped pretending she expected one. Millbrook was a small enough place that a duke's carriage, appearing outside the same modest cottage 8 times in as many weeks, did not go unnoticed. By the 9th visit, the baker's wife had begun a rumor that Clara Whitfield was secretly a long-lost relation of the Ashcombe family. By the 10th, the rumor had shifted to something closer to the truth, whispered behind gloved hands at the village church, that the Duke of Ashcombe, cold and unmarried these 6 years since his father's death, had found something at that small cottage that all the eligible daughters of the county, with their fortunes and their pedigrees, had failed to offer him. Clara heard the whispers and told herself firmly that they were nonsense. The Duke visited because of his mother, because gratitude properly observed required more than a single call, because she told herself this part rather less firmly. He was beneath the coldness the county attributed to him, simply a man who found conversation with her agreeable, in the same unremarkable way one might find conversation with any acquaintance agreeable. She held to this belief with some determination until the 11th visit, when Lady Margaret Ashcombe, now fully recovered and installed once more at Ashcombe Hall, sent a carriage not for her son's business, but for Clara herself, an invitation to take tea at the hall directly. Clara arrived nervous and underdressed, certain she had misunderstood the purpose of the visit, only to find Lady Margaret waiting for her alone in a bright morning room, a knowing smile already in place. Sit, child. I have been wanting to speak. With you without my son hovering nearby pretending. He has business elsewhere. Clara sat uncertain. Your Grace, You saved my life in that storm, Miss Whitfield, and asked for nothing in return. Lady Margaret set down her teacup. I have lived a long time, and I have met a great many people who wanted a great many things from me. You are not one of them. Do you understand how rare that is? In my son's experience? My son, Lady Margaret said, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision, my son has visited your cottage 11 times in 2 months for a debt that could have been discharged in a single afternoon. He has cancelled 2 dinners in London and postponed a visit to his northern estates that his steward has written to me about with some alarm. Julian does not do things without purpose, Miss Whitfield. He never has. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I assure you, Lady Margaret, I have never presumed. I am not accusing you of presuming anything, child. Lady Margaret looked at her carefully. I am telling you what I see with my own eyes, because I suspect my son is too proud or too frightened to tell you himself. Julian arrived at Clara's cottage that evening with no excuse prepared at all. No physician's letter, no basket of provisions, no invented estate business. He stood at her gate in the fading light, hat in hand, and found himself, for the first time since he had inherited his title, entirely without the words to explain his presence. Clara came to the door before he could knock, having watched the familiar black carriage approach from her window with a heart that would no longer be reasoned into calm. Your Grace, I owe you an honesty I have been avoiding for some weeks, Julian said, before he could lose his nerve. My mother tells me you deserve better than my continued pretense of gratitude as an excuse. Clara's breath caught. And what pretense would that be? That I come here for her sake? He stepped closer, close enough that Clara could see the uncertainty in a face the county had long assumed, incapable of it. I do not, I have not, since perhaps the 3rd visit, if I am honest with myself, which I have been trying, rather poorly not to be, Julian. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he heard the way it altered something in his chest, some tightness he had carried since his father's death, and had stopped expecting to loosen. I did not intend to find myself here, he said. I have spent 6 years believing that duty and affection were separate, matters to be managed separately, and I confess I do not entirely know what to do with a woman who has made it impossible for me to keep them apart. Clara studied him, his careful coat, his uncertain hands, the coldness the county spoke of, nowhere visible in the man standing at her gate, and found she no longer wished to protect herself from what she felt. I gave your mother a carriage in the rain, because it seemed the only decent thing to do, she said. I did not expect it to lead me here. She looked into his eyes. But I find, Your Grace, that I am not sorry it did. 1 year later, the wedding took place in early summer, in the small parish church at Millbrook, rather than the grand cathedral society expected of a duke, Julian's choice, made without hesitation, because it was the church where Clara had been christened and where, he said, the truest parts of their story belonged. Lady Margaret sat in the front pew in a gown the color of good health, having fully recovered from the chill that had once nearly cost her life, and watched her son marry a woman who had never once, in 2 years of acquaintance, asked him for anything at all. Clara's brother, his weak chest much improved under the care of Ashcombe's physicians, stood as witness, beaming in a coat too fine for him, and entirely too pleased with himself about it, and in the receiving line afterward, as the village that had once whispered behind gloved hands now offered its congratulations freely. Lady Margaret took Clara's hands in her own and smiled, the same knowing smile she had worn that first afternoon in the morning-room. I told you, child, kindness given without expectation is rare enough to be remembered. I simply did not expect my son to remember it quite so thoroughly. Clara laughed, glancing across the churchyard to where Julian stood in quiet conversation with her brother, looking nothing at all like the cold, unreachable duke the county had once believed him to be. "Neither did I, your grace," she admitted. "Neither did I." If you enjoyed this story, don't leave just yet. There is another Victorian romance waiting for you here on English Love Stories. If you love stories about dukes, forbiddance, love, Victorian era, and historical romance, I think you'll enjoy it. Click the story on your screen now, and let the next chapter begin. And if you haven't already, subscribe to English Love Stories for more emotional historical romance stories every week. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.